everyone. I'm Alicia Menendez. A little bit about me before we get started. I grew up in Union City, New Jersey. I still live in New Jersey. I'm a mom to two girls under 5. I'm an anchor at MSNBC. I wrote a book called The Likeability Trap that deals with likability as a cover for bias in the workplace. I co-own and host a podcast called Latina to Latina. It recently hit 1 million downloads. If you're not already a listener, every week I talk with remarkable Latinas about their professional and personal lives. And today I am speaking with a remarkable Latina who I am a big fan of and very excited to watch what she has done and what she continues to do. You know her well. Her name is Julissa Arce. You either know her because you have read one of her best-selling books, My Underground American Dream, or Someone Like Me, maybe you've read them both, or you are a Hysteria podcast listener, or you follow her on Instagram, where you rely on her to share stories from our community that would otherwise go underreported. And if you follow her, you know that she has got a ton of verve and grit and heart and style, and she's prolific, so prolific that she has another book coming out. It is going to be huge. It's called You Sound Like a White Girl, The Case for Rejecting Assimilation, and Julissa is going to give us a preview of it today. Julissa, I always hate these introductions because they make someone who's so dynamic and impressive seem so square. That's just like a list of the things you've done in the past few years. So tell me, what did I miss in that introduction that the people who love you most would want me to know?
Yeah, thanks. I always hate being on camera for the introductions. I always just want to it's hide and then come back out when the intro is done. But that was actually not super uncomfortable. So thank you. Let's see, things that I feel like I care about a lot are things like my scholarship fund, where we're going to be celebrating our 10th year in 2012. And we've awarded over $600,000 in college scholarships to immigrant students, regardless of their immigration status. I feel like I need to talk more about that because I am incredibly proud of our 80 plus students that we've been able to help go to college and graduate from college through our mentorship program. So that's really an important part of my life. To set the record straight, I live in Los Angeles. People always think that I still live in New York because I lived there for 10 years. People think that I live in Texas because that's where I grew up.
So if anyone has access to your Wikipedia page, this is the time. You now have a source. To be clear, Los Angeles.
Yes, exactly. I've lived in Los Angeles for the last 6 years. So I don't know if the people of Los Angeles claim me as an Angelino, but I feel like I'm getting there, like in 4 more years. I feel like 10 years is a magic number. And I have 2 cats.
I love it. I almost put cat lover in here and then I decided.
Yeah. Well, here's the thing. I don't love all cats. I love my cats. So I don't know that I'm a cat lover, I'm an equal and
I understand the difference. And it's like funny. I said, you just bought a house. You're a cat lover. So I'll take that out. Before we get into the conversation about assimilation, I want to do some term setting because I feel like it is a word that gets used and people use differently. And I'm sure that is something you reckoned with as you were pitching this book and writing this book. So how is it that you are defining assimilation?
Yeah, so I think, the way that I define assimilation is sort of a transformation culturally. So that I think is sort of the big definition that I used to guide me when I was writing this book, which is a cultural transformation, one which doesn't allow you to keep the things that make you you. Okay? It's sort of like a shedding of your culture, of your language, of your identity. And I use this metaphor in the book, which I say it's not like, when a snake sheds its skin because it's healing, because it got injured, or because it's time to sort of let go of that skin, but it still remains the snake, right? That skin, they're able to shed it, but continue to be a snake. I think assimilation does not allow you to do that. Especially in the United States. Assimilation is sort of like shedding everything about you and you don't get to be you anymore. You've got to become someone else in order to fit in. That's how I think about assimilation.
Because my dad's Cuban. I'm second generation. He's the first in his family brought here. I didn't get those messages about assimilation growing up. I got the message that it was really important that we hold on to our culture and that we be really clear about the ways in which our culture was special and unique and a thing that had value and was worth celebrating. What were the messages that you got about assimilation growing up?
Yeah, I do think that because, I am an immigrant, right? I came from the US when I was 11 years old. And so the very first message that I received when I came here was learn how to speak English, right? And there was this sort of notion that when you learned how to speak English, that would somehow help you to belong in this country, right? And so I did. I learned how to speak English. But then what happens is that after I learned how to speak English, it was a matter of like my accent and trying to get rid of my accent. And the reason the book is called You Sound Like a White Girl is because when I was in high school, this boy I had a crush on told me, you sound like a white girl. And I took that as a compliment. I was so like excited that I sounded like a white girl without realizing how small that had made me feel, like that I had to sound like something else in order to be popular in school, in order to belong in this country. I had to speak English a certain way. And so I feel like more than giving us belonging, English is something that is used against us to keep us separate. But so that was the very, very first message. And I think the way that I sort of organize the book is sort of the lies that are told to us, and then how we can reclaim the things about us, right? So I think English is like the first lie of assimilation, and one that that a lot of times is the first thing that immigrants hear, and even people who are born here, that maybe Spanish was their first language at home and then had to learn English at school. But I'm even curious, like your parents instilled in you sort of like this is your heritage. But I wonder if there was still some code switching that you had to do, being at home and being in a professional setting and being at home and being with your friends. And I still think that is part of assimilation.
Right. I remember
like that code switching. It's not about being proud, because I was proud, but it was about having to let go of those things when I was in certain settings.
Yeah, absolutely. I also think there's so many things that are necessary for context, right? Like the fact that I grew up in Union City, New Jersey, where the vast majority of my peers were also Latino, just meant that I wasn't other there. If anything, the otherness was about the fact that my mom is not Latina, and about the fact that I didn't speak Spanish at home. And like, I remember, we would do like International Day. And the funny thing about International Day in Union City is everyone's like, which beans are you going to bring? Because that's going to be the thing that is most going to be the differential in our cultures. And people would always want me to do something Norwegian because my mom is of Norwegian heritage. And I'd be like, I don't want to. I want to bring croquetas like everybody else. Like I want to be a part of this thing. But I went to a high school where there was, it was a private high school and there weren't a lot of other Latinos there. And I remember my friend Ana Mari was having her quince and I was dancing at the quince and I was trying to explain to all my friends at school what it was. And I remember a girl, she did not mean anything by this, but she said, "Oh, sweet 15, like, does she not think she's going to live until 16? And it was the first moment that I was like, not the first, it was a moment that sticks out in my mind as my realizing that I was going to have to explain, and that I was going to have to, that there were things that were subtle. Like in Union City, we would hug and kiss each other, like before we went into class each day. Like that was just culturally appropriate. And that wasn't culturally appropriate in my high school. And it was, as you say, sometimes like these very subtle things. And as you know, I wrote a book about, I looked at women in the workplace, but I spent a lot of time talking.
I have your book.
Thank you. You can tell when someone's written a book because they totally understand that, like, the book, you got to sell the book forever. And we'll talk about how we're all going to pre-order Julissa's book. The workplace is so interesting because there's a concept called covering that happens in different functions, but it happens especially in the workplace, where if someone has any type of marginalized identity is not in the majority of their workplace, that then covering can take a lot of forms. It can be a woman who dyes her hair because she doesn't want people to know how old she is. It can be someone who's LGBTQ not talking about their partner because they don't want their sexual orientation to be a topic of conversation at work. It can be two Latinos who both speak Spanish sitting next to each other in cubicles and being like, we're going to agree that we're never going to talk Spanish to each other because we don't want to draw attention to the fact that we both speak Spanish, so they're both othered. And I wonder the ways in which you see assimilation showing up for us in the workplace.
Yeah. I mean, I think the workplace is a perfect example of assimilation, right? Because so I talked about like the lie of English, right? Then there is the light of whiteness, which is like a really big lie. And then there's the lie of success, right? So one of the chapters in the book is about the lie of success. So this idea that like when you get a very cushy job or you have some sort of financial success, that is what's going to make you belong, because as immigrants, you know, we're told you got to pull yourself by the bootstraps like the good European immigrants of the past and like make something of yourself in this country. And then you get to work and you get to that cushy job, as I did, working on Wall Street for 10 years and at Goldman Sachs for most of it. And certainly there was a level of like, I've made it, you know, I've made it to this job. But then it was all the things that, again, like I had to give up in order to fit into that culture, into that space. You know, from things like my nails. Like I would have never been able to have nails like this, you know? Like
I muted myself because my kid is sleeping and I'm like, she's going to wake up the minute. But I was about to say your nail. You like brought them across the screen as though you were.
You know, and like I could have worn this nails. I can't wear like big hoop earrings. You know, maybe this one's because they have like a little pearl on them. Maybe, you know, but I would have been nervous the whole day wearing this, being super self-conscious, be like, are people looking at me? Like, and so I think like the workplace, when we talk about like diversity, inclusion, I think that all those words fall really short of what we should actually be aspiring to, right? Which is more about inclusivity, which is more about belonging in the workplace. Like because I think that all of these things that we talk about, diversity in relation to what, right? Being included to what circles, and all of those things center whiteness. All of those things at the center of it is being diverse vis-a-vis white people, being included in white circles, right? And so I think that still is a framework of assimilation. That's still a framework of what are the things that we have to change in order to fit in. And then what you realize is, well, at least what I realized, was that I no longer wanted to sound like a white girl in order to be taken seriously at work. You know, I had male colleagues who would pound the desk and be like, you know, explosive, like banging the headset against the desk. And like, that was acceptable. But anytime I would come in and be like, hey, yo, you know, how are you doing? Or hey, y'all, even the y'all, you know, or I would laugh loudly because I naturally have a loud laugh. And then my boss pulled me aside and said, like, you're very loud at the desk. Like laughing that loudly is not professional. And, you know, I was just so confused because why is my laugh not acceptable? But this very crazy behavior, I mean, that's not acceptable anywhere, but especially in my mind, not at the workplace, but somehow it was.
I actually thought you were going in a slightly different direction, which was if you had expressed anger the way that guy expressed anger, the way those guys expressed anger, it also would have been marked differently. It would have been,
absolutely.
Right? Like that becomes both because of gender and because of race and ethnicity, right? That it would have 100%. It would have been an incredible liability for you to express anger in the workplace.
Yeah. And that's why assimilation and these frameworks are so dangerous, because, you know, I wanted to mimic the behavior of my bosses and my colleagues, right? Like I wanted to be like them. And so when I tried to be like them, though, it wasn't received in the same way, to your point, right? Like I mean, the trading floor is like a petri dish of curse words, like, you know, everybody. And so cursing was sort of like a part of a part of it. But I definitely did notice that like women curse less. I naturally curse a lot just because I always have, like watching sports and just, it's part of my vocabulary. But having to be self-conscious about how those things would be perceived, right? So that's why assimilation is it's a bunch of bullshit, because it sort of says if you do these things, you will belong. And then you do all of those things and the goalpost keeps moving and it keeps moving and it keeps moving. And it's like this unreachable finish line that it's like no matter what you do, there's still going to be something else you have to do.
It also strikes me, being someone who is not first gen, how much of that gets passed on intergenerationally. Because in as much as, for example, I don't contend with language the way that you contended with English, but I contend with the expectation that I should speak Spanish, right? What we saw Julian Castro go through, where and he spoke so beautifully about it. This sort of damned if you do, damned if we don't. We're told to learn English, to lose our accents. Then we learn English. The next generation doesn't speak Spanish, and then we get slammed for that. This idea that we are only worthy if we achieve tremendously. I mean, that was certainly passed on to me, even though it wasn't linguistically about mastery of a language or accenting. My dad was also always very clear with me that the first thing people would judge me on was the way that I looked, and the second thing they would judge me on was the way that I spoke. And that once those judgments were made, they couldn't be undone. And so I do think also when we don't reckon with some of these ideas, that they do continue to pass them on. I think one of the things that is complicated when you are talking something about something as big as assimilation, or one's relationship to assimilation, or in my case, the book I wrote, When You Reckon with Likability, is it's not turn of a switch stuff. It's not like you have an experience where you recognize the limits of assimilation and then you say, well, I'm done assimilating. And then the next day you wake up and you put in your earrings and you do your nails and you go to work and you start just being yourself. No. It is a process of undoing and letting go. What does that process look like for you, and what has it required from you?
Yeah. So for me, it was less about letting go and more about reclaiming, more about gathering the things that I had lost, the things that I had given up and left behind, and trying to gather them all again. Right. And one of the things that I did in the book was to really unearth a lot of veiled history, like history that we don't know, right? So for example, when you're talking about Secretary Castro, he sort of talked about his grandmother and how she didn't want her daughter to speak Spanish because of the discrimination she might face if she did, right? And English has been used so violently against us, whether it's to segregate us in schools, whether it's was to sterilize women with documents they could not understand, to more recently, like this two women in Montana who were stopped because they were speaking Spanish by Border Patrol, even though they're U.S. citizens, right? So all of this history are things that are lost, and then we don't know how deep our roots are in this country. We don't know the violence that our people have faced in this country. And therefore, we don't know the magnitude of the problems we are facing. And so for me, reclaiming that history was really, really important, because it's history we never learned in school. So, I can't tell you the number of like revisionist history books that I read by Latino historians to understand my place in this country better. And so that, it's about reclaiming our history. It was about reclaiming our identity, because many times people put labels on us as Latinos, Hispanics, Latinx, and it's somebody else that's sort of deciding how we should identify, both ethnically and racially. And it was about reclaiming our heritage and all of the things that are beautiful about us, because there's so many things that are beautiful about us as a community and as individual cultures within the Latino, culture, sort of that broader Latino culture. So for me, it was more about that, sort of reclaiming.
I might get that tattooed, not letting go, reclaiming. I mean, I just think that applies to so many things. I love that idea so much. All right. Let's get into the idea of Latinidad. How do you define it?
I thought about this question a lot. I certainly thought about it a lot when I was writing the book, and it was probably the hardest part of the. I mean, I think I must have rewritten that part like a million times, and I still want to rewrite it now, even though I mean the book is done.
I wish we lived in a moment where we were allowed to be more iterative, right?
Yeah.
Where like ideas were constantly allowed to be revised and extended.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, that is a point that I make about Latinidad, right? And it's funny because I feel like I didn't start thinking about Latinidad until recently, the last few years, right? Like when I wasn't an author or an activist, when I was, sitting at my desk working on Wall Street, I did not even know that a word Latinidad existed, right? Like I was just like, I'm Mexican, I'm an immigrant, I'm Latina, and even how I described myself when I lived in Texas, I described myself as Hispanic, and I didn't like the word Latina. And now understanding the roots of the words and where they came from and who came up with them and how they are used, I much more identify with the word Latina. I even identify with the word Chicana, even though I am actually from Mexico, was born in Mexico, grew up in Mexico, but my experience in this country made me feel like I am Chicana, And so I think Latinidad is a thing like American that cannot be defined by a single person, by a single thing, because I think each of us should get to define what it means for us. I have found belonging in the Latino community where I could not find it anywhere else. In the presence of Latinos is where I have let go of my assimilated self, where I feel closest to my soul. And that's something that I understand perhaps is because of how I look, right? People will look at me and know that I am Latina. Right? I'm sure people sometimes look at you, and if they don't know your last name, think you're not Latina, right? And same thing happens to Black Latinos, right? Where they have to constantly sort of assert their Latino-ness in a place that in a culture that has rejected Blackness from the very beginning of the founding of our nations, right? And you have to understand why that is. And I think when you have an appreciation of why our ancestors were forced into aspiring to whiteness, you look at it from a different lens and sort of perhaps, I mean, for me, I look at it with sort of a much more compassionate lens of like why they had to do those things. But also at the same time, we sort of can figure out a formula for how to reject anti-Blackness and anti-indigeneity in our community. So that's a really big question. And one that I certainly spend a lot of time thinking about and exploring and reframing in the book.
So I think part of what I'm hearing from you, that when it comes to this conversation about dismantling Latinidad, much like the way you sort of challenge the framework of letting go and made it about reclaiming, there are people who argue that we need to completely dismantle and let go of Latinidad. Do you think there is a way instead to redefine and reclaim it?
Yes, I do. I think that, and people will disagree with me on this. I know people disagree with me on this, which is that the concept of race and ethnicity and Latinidad is something that was born here in the United States. Right? I didn't think of myself as Latina when I lived in Mexico. I was Mexican. And so I do think that, and my experience as a Mexican in Mexico was different than my experience as a Mexican in the United States. And so I think sometimes people want to apply a framework of race that is used in Latin America and take that framework and apply it to Latinos in the United States. And I think that ignores so much of what we collectively experience in this country, regardless of whether you're from Honduras or Mexico or El Salvador or, you know, any other place. Certainly, you know, within those countries that I just mentioned, like, I do think that a lot of Salvadorans would say that, like, Mexicans are racist and that Mexicans have been racist towards Salvadorans, and certainly they have. But then when you come to this country, you know, I think a lot about what happened in El Paso. And I think about this white nationalist going to El Paso and going there to, as he admitted, you know, in a manifesto that authorities believed he authored. You know, it's funny that I say that now because, like, I just wanted to say that he wrote, but then, like, legal, when I was writing my book, was like, you can't, you know, you can't say all those things because he hasn't even been, like, convicted, et cetera, et cetera. But I think about him, and I think about when he went down there, you know, to target Mexicans. I think in his mind, he wasn't like Mexicans from Mexico, you know. It's like he was thinking about Latinos more broadly, right? And if you looked brown to him, and if you looked Latino to him, it didn't matter if you were from Mexico or from El Salvador. Like, he was there to target you. And so I do think that in the United States, we have a collective different experience, and and in that collectiveness, not to say it's the same, right? It's not to say it's the same, but we do have something that unites us. And I think that in those things, there's a lot of power. There's a lot of political power that our community needs, that we aren't going to harness unless we can come together in some way, shape, or form. Because otherwise, you know, we don't have that collective power.
How do we as a community address the patriarchal constructs that lead to the erasure of Latina leadership specifically? I know there's, like, no neat answer. I mean, these are very conceptual.
They're very conceptual
questions, and I think a big part, especially because you and I are both storytellers, is always beginning there too.
Yeah,
is changing the stories that are told, diversifying the stories that are told.
You know, what's interesting is that, like, in my family, right, and I think in a lot of Latino families, Mexican families specifically, grandmothers and mothers are, like, revered. You know, they're like, we are a matriarchal, like, society, and so it's always been interesting to me that even though that's true, it doesn't sort of extend to other parts of society, right? It's like something that lives in the family nucleus, and, like, doesn't we don't take it with us to other places that we go, and, like, we should. But in my own experience, like with my mom was the one that worked. You know, my dad is the one that, like, stayed home with us, took us to school, packed our lunches, like, took me to cheerleading practice. And my mom was the one that worked, you know? And so I sort of guess I've always grown up with, and the same was true, like, my grandfather passed away a long, long time ago when I was, like, 3 or 4 years old. And I always saw my grandmother as, like, a working woman, you know? She owned a business and, like, she went to work, and I saw it with my mom. And so I personally have had very good and clear examples of a woman who is independent, a woman who is professional, a woman who is the leader, right? Like, the women in my family were the leaders, both in the home and outside of it. And so I also think that we need to your point about stories, like, we need to share those stories, and we need to change the narrative of how we see ourselves and how we see our own community, because there are many examples of, like, badass Latinas who are doing incredible things, both in their homes and outside of it. And you know, when I listen to your podcast, I'm constantly amazed at what all these women have accomplished. And I'm so glad you're telling those stories, because I think it helps us to change how we see ourselves and what we think it's possible for us as women, as Latinas.
Thank you for that. Right. You know the sweat and hustle that goes into a labor of love like that. So thank you.
Yeah.
All right, we got to talk about the book and how we can all support the book. You sound like a white girl, the case for rejecting assimilation. So this is the period where we can pre-order the book. Yes. And I'm going to do this plug so that I'm going to absolve you of doing the plug, which is when you write a book, your publishing house tells you if you want to get on any of the bestsellers lists, it is all about these pre-orders. The pre-orders are the best way to guarantee that you make it. And that matters because you might love Julissa, you might love ideas that challenge us, you might just want to see more Latina authors get book deals. It all matters. And pre-ordering someone's book, not saying you will pre-order someone's book, not ordering it 5 weeks later, ordering it now or in the run-up to its publication is truly the most important thing that you can do. Those numbers matter. Publishing houses watch those numbers. And it is as much an indication of Julissa's following as it is the power of our community. So it is something that I learned I was deeply unaware of prior to writing my own book. I did not understand just how much that can create momentum. It changes in publishing houses, the budgets they put behind doing PR for books, like it fundamentally changes the course of a book's trajectory. So that is my case for just like walking your fingers over, ordering it now. Tell your local bookstore you want them to carry it. If it is out of your price range, ask your library to carry it. That matters too. Julissa, I'm going to let you have the last word.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. I always love when we talk, and it never feels like we're like recording this. It just feels like this is a conversation. Get us in trouble one day. I know. This is like a conversation we would have had just like on FaceTime, as other conversations we've had. So thank you. And yeah, I think what I will say about the book is that the book is not prescriptive. This book is not do these things so that you can reclaim, right? It's more like these are the things I did. And what I hope most is that it starts conversations, that people talk about it with their moms and their cousins and their coworkers, and that they hopefully that it offers them a different perspective, and that it offers them some tools to talk about some of these things. But most importantly, that I hope that the thing that people come away with after reading the book is just how incredible we are and how incredible our community is. And like my belief is in you, it's in me, it's in us.
I love that. I also know how book publishing works and know that we're going to end up with You Sound Like a White Girl, the handbook for rejecting assimilation, as a follow-up to this book, because everybody does want prescription. And so I look forward to you making a lot of money off of writing journal prompts. And,
well, thank you. And it's too. Well, here it is. This is the cover.
That could be yours. You could have that in your hands on public.
And yours will be hardcover and prettier. This is just, an advanced reader copy type thing.
Just to give you an idea.
Yeah.
All right. Julissa, thank you so much. And thank you to all of you for joining us.
Yeah. Thank you so much.